Again, Professor Zeeb here. Welcome on in. And this time I'm going to teach you about the physical development of early adulthood. Okay. So to me, this is a really relatable lecture for you because most of you are probably in this age range. So we're going to look at that and what happens with our bodies during this time. Okay. So let's take a look here. Okay, so physical development in early adulthood. Just to kind of refresh your memory, remember early adulthood, technically considered to be late teens through your 30s, okay? So we're gonna look at that time frame and really to kind of put it in a nutshell, especially in your 20s, this is a time of peak physical condition. Most of us are at the best we will ever be during this time on average, okay? But ironically, it's also the beginning of decline. So we're actually going to see, believe it or not, you're so young, and yet we still see the beginnings of decline present during this time. I mean, you could even argue some of those are in play at the end of adolescence. All right, so let's take a look here. So once again, to put it bluntly, the peak is reached. So we're going to find that physical development tends to peak out and stabilize during this time and then even start to decline. So our physical changes will definitely slow down, meaning in terms of like growth, we will find that sort of levels out during this time, but there will be some changes which we'll talk about. Your prime physical condition has now been reached. So in terms of speed and strength, meaning, athletic skills, for example, for most people, usually before 30, this will peak out and max out. However, you could argue that your energy starts to decline. I remember thinking back to my mid-20s, around 25 or so, I started noticing some changes. I still had lots of energy, but my energy levels were not quite the same when I was a few years younger. So personally, I can kind of relate to that. Around 25, 26, I really started to notice that. So the research does sort of confirm that our physical condition really peaks out and maxes out between 19 to 26. The efficiency of body functions begins to decline. So once again, it's so unfair because you're still so young and you only have lived a fraction of what you will actually live, and yet the declines already are kicked into action here. So for example, your heart is not as efficient as it was when you were younger. So we see the beginnings of that. And a lot of these changes in the body that we're going to see, of course, are developmental in nature due to things like genetic programming, but certainly environmental factors are really going to come into play in terms of how you've lived your life, lifestyle choices, which are covered a little bit later on in the chapter, in the next lecture. So we're going to find that may start to sort of come back and haunt you. And certainly by the time we hit middle age, we're really going to see the effects of those, okay? So it's the classic nature nurture there. We're going to see some connections. All right, so let's look at some milestones and different ages in terms of what happens. And we're going to break it up into categories in male and female. Let's start with height. All right, so ladies out there, you can expect to reach your maximum height around age 18. So, once again, at the beginning of adulthood there, you'd be the tallest you will ever be in most cases. For males, we're a little bit behind, so it's about 20 for our average male. Not only that, after 26, your spinal discs start to settle, causing slight decrease in height. So in other words, not only do you reach your maxed out height, if you would, but actually we lose a little height after 26. Once again, that's because the spinal discs are settling. We're talking a fraction of an inch, if anything, and yet there it is. We do see some evidence that your height will decrease. In fact, if you ever measure yourself when you're 18 and then measure yourself when you're, 30, you would see some differences. So most people will lose a little height there. Once again, it's pretty small and minimal. However, by the time we're 70 or 80, this loss could be as much as 2 inches. And we'll talk about that in later chapters. But it's interesting how at this point we've been growing and growing, going up, and now we stabilize and even actually lose a little bit in terms of height. All right, so now we're going to talk about the elephant in the room, and that's weight, which nobody really wants to talk about. So weight between the ages of 20 and 30, obviously a sensitive topic for a lot of people. So ladies, you can expect to gain about 14 pounds during your 20s on average. And that's because your body is designed to increase in body fat and to hold on to that body fat. So about 14 pounds. Gentlemen, it's about 15 pounds, okay? And really one of the reasons for this is the fatty tissue increases, causing weight gains. So our body is starting to hold on to fat more. And so you definitely see most people are gonna gain weight on average, okay? I don't know if they call it the freshman 5 or something like that or whatever it is, but anyway, you can kind of expect that on average. Now remember, that's an average. For some people it would be less, some people would be more. But if we sort of ironed all that out and averaged it out, it's about 14 and then 15 pounds for males. Keep in mind, our metabolism is also starting to slow down, especially after 30. So that is also a reason why you would sort of gain weight or not lose weight as readily, if that makes sense. So our body is just not burning calories as fast as it once was, say, like in adolescence. Okay, so now we're going to look at muscle strength and internal organs after 26. We're going to see a decrease in muscle strength, okay? Remember, a lot of research sort of shows that our athletic skill peaks out between about 20 and 30. Remember, I'm speaking in terms of speed and strength. So especially sports that require speed of limb movement, explosive strength, gross body coordination as an example, that really seems to peak out in our early 20s, okay? So sprinting, jumping, to me, how I can personally relate to that is playing tennis. I played tennis in college, and I really noticed, once again, after about 25, I saw those differences. In fact, a lot of tennis pros peak out very early. In fact, when you hit 30, you're almost considered over the hill, which is so ironic. But you've probably noticed that a lot of our professional athletes are in their 20s, especially like the Olympics and things like that. A lot of them are very young. Certainly they could be older than 30, depending on the sport, of course. It kind of depends on what's required. But this sort of explains why a lot of our professional athletes are pretty young, because our body is designed to be athletic early on. So especially our early 20s is when we really see that peaking, if you would. Now, keep in mind, things like training and practice can delay those changes. So that's the good news. That's the silver lining there, is that sometimes when people train, those delays would actually be less, okay? We're also going to find our reaction time stabilizes. So reaction time is kind of how fast you can react to something. So for example, if I turned on a light and you had to push a button as fast as you could when that light came on, that's what we mean by reaction time. So the time it takes from the light to go on to pushing the button would be your reaction time. So we're finding that during early adulthood, this really stabilizes, okay? However, as we get older, we're gonna find delays in that. And that turns out is due to physical and developmental reasons, but also psychological factors. But we'll come back to that in our later chapters. So at this point, we can say that our reaction time stabilizes. We're also going to see some declines in terms of cardiac output. It turns out that our heart muscles become more rigid over time. So cardiac output is how efficient your heart is at getting oxygenated blood throughout the body. I mean, that's one of the major functions of the heart, is to deliver blood, which contains oxygen throughout the body in terms of a pumping system, right? So over time, as our heart muscles become more rigid, the heart's ability to meet the oxygen demands of the body, especially when we're stressed through exercise, become taxed, and therefore it creates problems. Remember, this is obviously affected by lifestyle. So if you're a smoker, you know, maybe you vape or something like that, or you're a heavy drinker, et cetera, that would create even more change in this system. So remember, we're talking on average to factor all those things in, but certainly lifestyle factors can really play a huge role in terms of how quick this happens and how drastic those changes are. All right, so next, we're going to talk about the sensory changes. Really, these show little change. I mean, there is some change, but it's very slight. And you could almost argue the beginnings of those changes are happening where they're really going to sort of play out in middle age, as we'll talk about in later chapters. Okay, so in terms of vision, we can see that during this time, the process of losing lens flexibility. I don't know if you guys know your eye anatomy, but the lens is this curved structure in the eye which sort of bends to allow us to accommodate different distances. Okay, so it actually refracts light waves. So we can actually see the process of this happening, and really most people do not notice it until about 30. I mean, you may notice some slight changes, if anything, but really around 40 is the major change when we get into middle age, and we'll talk about that later. So believe it or not, guys, these changes happen as early as childhood. You would not notice them in any way, but then usually around 30 or so is when we sort of start to notice those in a small way. So the point is the beginnings are being, you know, that wheel is being put into motion in terms of those changes, which will sort of worsen over time. Detection of high-pitched sounds. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with sound waves and things like that. So our higher pitched sounds are the higher sounding sounds, if you would. So if you're a piano player, it's the notes all the way to the right of the piano, okay? Those are higher pitched. So in terms of the sounds we are losing, our ability to detect higher pitched sounds seems to be affected first. Keep in mind, this change is more than twice as rapid for men compared to women. In other words, women are able to hear higher pitched sounds longer than our typical male can during this time. So why is that? Well, some people argue that may be an evolutionary thing where it enables, remember this is theoretical, you know, you make up your own mind if you agree with this, but if it's an evolutionary explanation, what they're saying is that this may enable females to be able to hear the crying infant more effectively than a male, because obviously women are typically traditionally the caregiver, not always, of course, but you know, evolutionary standpoint is a traditional standpoint. It may enable them to respond to the infant quicker or be able to hear the cries of the infant theoretically. Okay. So hearing usually starts to decline in the last part of early adulthood is what we're finding. Okay, now we go to the nervous system. So our brain increases in weight and reaches its maximum potential by the adult years. So the brain is continuing to develop into our 20s, believe it or not, and then it sort of stabilizes and reaches its maximum potential, okay? So brain development kind of levels off during this time, and then we're going to see some changes once we get to middle adulthood, and we'll talk about that later. All right, the last concept I want to cover in this lecture is something called the organ reserve. Okay, so what is that? The organ reserve, so it's a very technical definition here, but the part of the total capacity of our body's organs that we do not normally need to use. In other words, what we're saying here is that just like your car has a reserve gas tank, our body has reserves. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? Like some cars have a reserve gas tank. Like if you run out of gas, there's a little storage compartment apparently. I mean, I'm not a mechanic, but there's a little bit of fuel left to enable you to get to the gas station so you're not stranded. So in other words, in times of emergency, we can call on this reserve to get us to where we need to go. So it's kind of the same thing here, is that our bodies have reserves that they can call on in dire circumstances. So if we're starving, we're exhausted, we're in some kind of emergency situation where we're digging deep, so to speak, we have these reserves we can actually draw on and rely on, okay? So why are we talking about it now? These reserves, we've discovered, get smaller as we get older. In other words, you could argue that during early adulthood, our organs' peak performance starts to decline because these reserves become smaller, okay? So there's a lot of different examples of that, but the point is that you don't have as much to draw on compared to, say, when you were a teenager. Young adults often do not realize these declines. Did you guys notice that your organ reserve is getting smaller, right? Probably not in most cases. So why is that? Why don't most young adults know that these reserves are getting smaller? The simple answer is that most of us don't have to call on those, right? Remember, these are often more in play when we're in some kind of dire circumstance. I don't know if you guys ever watched that show Survivor, one of my favorite shows of all time, where these people are not eating, they're not sleeping, they're doing physically demanding challenges. So in other words, they're rock bottom and they're digging deep just to survive, you know, theoretically, if you buy into the show. So unless we're all on Survivor or on, you know, in some kind of similar circumstance, we probably wouldn't even notice that our organ reserves are getting smaller, okay? And yet research has confirmed this, that those reserves do get smaller as we get older, especially after 30. So once again, the reason is we seldom have to call on those, and that's why we probably don't notice it. But technically, those reserves are getting smaller in early adulthood. All right, so that will conclude our short lecture here, guys. Thanks for listening there, and we'll see you online.